comics are. This is a tapestry that I saw in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, where I live. And it's like the history of the world. They're done in panels, recurring characters. Jesus makes a lot of appearances in these things. It's fun. He's a very popular cartoon character. I noticed in living in Mexico, the murals there by Diego Rivera, it's this storytelling, and again, recurring characters. It's got panels at the bottom, like the daily life in black and white. They're in panels, and you'll know recurring characters. This is there, but in the upper left, there's this creepy guy, and then he shows up again. It's here, and then he shows up here. There's Cortez in the background. All this horrific history of the conquistadors coming to Mexico, but done, not in a straight sequence like you might think of it in panels, like in a comic, but it nonetheless is storytelling, and it's a picture that can be read, and I started to appreciate the quality of murals. Another thing that's interesting is how throughout time artists have wanted to talk about the political situation and illustrate history in that way. Even when it was a problem, like Daumier did these drawings of the king, and he ended up spending 6 months in prison because of this. So the artists, very often when they were doing political art, they had to do it to one side, hide it, or if they put it up in front of it, they could go to jail. In the United States, there was a cartoon named Thomas Nast, and this is a famous character in the middle there, a guy named Boss Tweed. If you saw the movie Gangs of New York, the Scorsese film, have you seen that? Scorsese?
Yes. I did.
Anyway, Boss Tweed shows up as a character in there. It's early New York City, American history, and this guy, this vulture in the middle, was stealing money from the treasury. He was also helping, he got elected and he helped his constituency, the Irish community, but he was also stealing millions of dollars. And when he was going to be arrested for this robbery, he fled to Portugal. And the customs officials recognized him from this trial, and he was arrested, and he died in jail penniless. So sometimes art can actually, you don't go to jail, the subject goes to jail. So I'm doing a lot of runs with Donald Trump. So in the early 20th century, there was magazines like The Masses that gave a forum to the artists and cartoonists who drew these things. There's a perfect soldier from World War I. The magazine was shut down as we were entering the war because anything that wasn't pro-war was shut down. In Germany, there was Simplicissimus, and it was the same story. It gave a forum to artists like Kathy Kollwitz and John Hartfield, who were protesting the rise of Hitler and trying to warn people about what's coming. So they were doing this in the early 30s and 20s and 30s, and they had to flee the country. Like George Gross had to flee to the United States to avoid being put in concentration camps, for example. So art can really have an impact, but it also can get killed. There's Guernica by Picasso, and it's interesting to me to see, in fine arts, most of the fine arts do political commentary as well about the bombing of the town of Guernica. So there we are, leaving our mark throughout history, trying, and I think a lot of it can just be trying to say, hey, I was here. Graffiti is, I'm not a big fan of tagging, just writing, spray painting something on the wall, just because I like more artistry. But I understand the desire to say, like, hey, I'm here, I'm not invisible. And I think that in a lot of ways, I took this picture in outlets for the kind of comics that I was doing and my friend was doing. And we both ended up in art school at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And we had done a fanzine together about comics before we were really drawing. And we couldn't find any outlet for the kind of work we were doing, the kind of work that we loved. And so we decided to self-publish it. And we called the magazine World War III Illustrated because Ronald Reagan, this is going very far back, was about to be president of the United States. And we were, there was a hostage crisis in Iran. And there was talk about there being a war between Russia and the United States, nuclear bombs. Sounds familiar. From last week's news or today. So that's why we came up with that title. But we were also looking at corporate America, Coca-Cola, for example. And so we published the magazine with our own money. And year after year, we kept on doing this work, still having trouble finding places to get published. And so more people joined us. So it wasn't just my work and my friend's work, and even we weren't the only people editing the magazine. And this keeps going on, and there kept being new subjects to talk about. Of course, sadly, we didn't solve all these problems with our comics. Year after year, we did the magazine, and actually we're still publishing it. So we're in our 43rd year, and the secret to our success is we've never made any money, so there's nothing to fight over. So it's not exactly a business plan, but we've managed to make it where each issue pays for itself. So another big influence for me was Mad magazine. And I grew up reading Mad. Did you see Mad here? Is that something that ever got? No. Anyway, it was very popular in the United States. It was selling millions of copies. And it really affected humor that it came out in a lot of other areas, like other magazines that followed this. It was really like a lot of the humor in the United States, Saturday Night Live, The Onion, I don't know if you've ever seen that. Those are all really coming from Mad magazine. And in some strange time machine turn events, they asked me to try out for this comic that they ran, Spy vs. Spy, which is actually talking about the Cold War. It's talking about Russia and the United States and the sort of absurdity of war. And I didn't create these characters. A Cuban artist did, a guy named Antonio Prohias. And he started in 1961. And in 1996, he had retired, and they asked me if I wanted to try out for it. I had really no interest in doing it, although I loved it as a kid. And I think it influenced me doing wordless comics, because it's a wordless comic. There's no text, per se. That's what his work looked like when he was doing it back then. It's all black and white. And so I thought, if I'm going to do this, I have to put my own stamp on it. This is one I did more recently, where they said, kind of draw it in his style. But, and now I don't mind, because I didn't feel like I was worrying about my identity being lost in trying to copy somebody else. But what I did was I said, well, what if I did stencils and spray paint? And it's actually cut paper, I'll show you more of that. And then cans of spray paint, like we spray on walls. And I thought, I'm going to do this, they're going to hate it, and then I can, say, well, I give it a shot. And so it's exactly what we're looking for, because we don't want somebody to slavishly copy the way it used to look. So here's a little bit of my process. So that I do a drawing on a napkin at dinner, probably had a couple of beers. Then I do a tighter sketch to try and determine if the story's working. Then something tighter to send to the editors. They have to approve what I do. And then even tighter, this one I did more work on than normal. That's the pencil drawing. And then I photocopy the pencil and cut stencils. So the little holes in the paper are where the spray paint will go through. And then that's the second stencil for the black. I sprayed it with red paint, and then with that movement stencil, it would be in black paint. And so you get this kind of glowing undertone. So it's taking something very hard line and then making stories are always like, one spy thinks he's winning, then the other spy thinks he's winning, and then it turns around. That's the ideal version of it. More recently, I've been playing off of different things. I took old comic book covers, Spider-Man, first appearance of Spider-Man, and I did them all like they were spy versus spy covers. I love playing with those things. This I thought was my last issue of Mad a year ago, and then they, of course, called me back to do one, which just came out this month. So I've been doing this for 27 years. Every one of these things, like, and then I did it for 1 million years. It happened. I thought it would do it for a year or two. It was very surprising. So I'm always trying to strip away like what the process is. So where do ideas come from? So in the case of Leonardo, probably was looking out the window and saw a bird, and he wondered about the structure of the wings, and then he thought about how could a human fly, and he did in fact develop these flying machines. They couldn't work at the time because the ideas were so far ahead of their time. It required the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk in the United States and to come up with, I think, it was in 1915, and then Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927 in the Spirit of St. Louis, and then that leads to jet bombers and mayhem and destruction. So sometimes you don't know where an idea is going to go, and maybe it's actually better just to stick with painting. So after you watch that, you don't know to get away from it. So an important thing that I recommend to everybody is keeping a sketchbook. Now I always have this one, which is where I get ideas. Say I'm sitting on the toilet or on the subway or at dinner, and I get a quick idea. And a lot of my ideas are really like this, like a dream. And if you don't get it down quickly, it disappears. You've got to have that experience. I also recommend writing down your dreams. You can make really good stories and useful information. So I've been keeping these little notebooks, but I also keep a regular sketchbook, which is more like something like this. And they've gotten quite elaborate over the years. I didn't mean to make them this elaborate. I try to just, it sort of started out slowly, and then form. But that's just after years of doing it. But I try not to be precious with them or worry about style. So that's an older sketchbook, and I'm just drawing around on different pages, and not worrying about getting it right. It's just sort of and it ends up being right because in a certain way because I'm just doing things for myself. I turn my sketchbook sideways for that one, and just sort of mix it up. This has really worked very well for me because I've ended up with whole books that were publishing aspects of my sketchbook. And if I hadn't been doing sketchbooking, it's another way also in a career of doing art where I want to determine what the projects are. And so it's rather than waiting for someone to call me and give me a job and say, here's the space, I'm doing this work, and then I look around and see how I'm turning it into something that somebody will pay me for. And I've done this a number of times. So I moved to Oaxaca, Mexico, this time in southern Mexico with my wife and daughter. When she was 9, because we wanted her to get a second language, and Spanish seemed good for New York. And I started doing these sketches, and it was a great opportunity to, so you get a sort of sense of the development of drawing and pen and ink, and then maybe take a picture of the thing, and when I get home, I'm doing some watercoloring. Some of it's from my imagination, some of it is what I draw on the spot, some collage maybe. So it's just a mixture of things, and then I sort of see how they fit together. We moved to this town, and I thought it was going to be only drawing in a sketchbook and relaxing and drawing cactus and nothing too heavy. This was during when George W. Bush was president, which is a horrible time period. One of the horrible time periods in the United States. And we got to this small town, I thought it would be very quiet. teacher strike going on, and this governor, who's pictured there, he was spray painted all over the walls, and people were, the teachers were encamped in the streets and fighting with the police, and then there was actually a bush with swastikas on it. They had put up just a sort of connective idea, and I ended up doing these drawings and then sending them to magazines, and because very few journalists were in the town, but were actually reporting from, say, Mexico City, which is 8 hours away, they were just using what the governor sent out and said, teachers are being ridiculous, they're still striking, whatever he said. And so I could comment on it from inside the city and do it through this sort of journalistic way. So about 20 people were killed or murdered by the governor's police as they tried to end this strike. It was an annual event that had gone on for 25 years. This is the first year where the strikers were attacked by the governor instead of giving a little bit of a pay raise. And so they said, well, we're not leaving them, and they fought back. And it's a very left-leaning town, and very, very politically active. And the governor just couldn't believe he was having this much trouble, and he just kept on fighting them and shooting them. And then an American journalist was down there, and he got shot and killed. And then it was an international incident, and there was suddenly federal troops were brought in, and it became a bigger scene. I started doing this drawing. There was a march going on. My wife and I had a date night, and I said, I heard there's a march that's going on. I just wanted to look at the drawing, so we went down there, and I drew it for quite a while. There were the teachers standing at a barricade, there was barbed wire, and then there were federal troops. And my wife was like, how romantic watching me draw. So we left, and as we were leaving, we probably just got to our car, the police attacked, and it turned out this was the moment that the entire thing blew up after 7 months, and this struck came to an end because they beat up and arrested 150 people. We missed being caught in this by a little bit. And when I got home and saw on the internet what had happened, so I finished the drawing with the police in there, topped them in. I did that for World War III. I did a longer piece talking about it, but I also did it for some other publications. And I was contacted by newspapers in Mexico City, and so it was a very strange thing to be like in the middle of this thing. And later, after 2 years of living in Mexico, I was just drawing in my sketchbook very regularly. I met a Mexican publisher, and I had also been writing and sending that to a website in the United States, and all of this was not being paid. So 2 years of just steadily working, and when it appeared on the website, stories about being in Oaxaca, they were just for, an arts website. But now I had done all this writing, and I had done all this drawing, and I proposed to this Mexican publisher, and what if we do this as a book? And they went for that, and I said, well, it would be really great if it's not just in Spanish, but also the text is also in English, because then you get all the tourists to get the book, which was completely what I just thought. It's going to get published a few thousand copies in Mexico, and none of my friends who don't speak Spanish will be able to read it. And so I said, let's make it bilingual. But at the last minute, I found an American U.S. publisher, and so they got together on the edition, and then it's staying in print, and the new edition just came out. This came out in 2009, and the new edition just came out last year. And I keep updating every time I go back to Mexico. I add pages to it. And this opened the door on visiting Mexico, going to literary festivals, and it's a very strange career. It's like one thing, I'll do something, and then it leads to another thing, like being right here, for example. I've been sending work to script work for 3 years, and I just sent the work, and this has brought me here, and last year I had an exhibition. Because an art director saw my sketchbooks, so I would show them once in a while. They asked me if I wanted to go to some Burning Man and see if they were So there I was. My daughter had just been born, and I got sent out to the for 5 days camping and trying to so people do these art projects, people get naked, at the very end now there's this giant man that they burn, and it's just, it's very, very artistic and very interesting things. There's one of the things there was a big wooden crate in the middle of the desert. The last day they opened it up and it was a giant ball of ice with clocks, and sort of you went up and went, and if you were in it, it was very, very, it was like air conditioning. So if you're interested in comics, I wanted to give you the secrets of the graphic novelist, so you know how you can proceed to go into this field like me. You have to be excited in a career in the arts, and you have to be incapable of doing a 9-to-5 job. Now you know. That's it. That's all I have to say. So I've done a number of graphic novels. This was a very odd one. I was asked by DC Comics, that does Batman and Superman. There was an editor that had just been hired, and I worked with him on High Times magazine and some guitar magazine, very little money, and he's like, hey, I'm an editor, do you have any ideas for stories? And I was like, well, I have this idea I've been thinking about for years, that I got when I was sitting on a subway. I got into the same last train at my subway stop, and there was a group of people, and then I get on another day, and it was a different group, and I was wondering, I wonder if these people will have any interaction in the future, like there'll be something will happen, maybe that person will save this person, maybe this person will kill that person, maybe this person will win the lottery and be rich and buy my book. And also I thought, I really want to do some things that haven't been done in mainstream comics, so I thought, it's going to be wordless, so following with this idea, and this is part of how I got this spy job. This is in 1995, but they asked me to do a script. I had to write out a script for each panel, even though there's no words in it. Then I do a breakdown. This is an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, a small piece of paper. I'm writing what's happening on each page so I can figure it out. Then I do these little booklets, and I draw, I take 8.5 by 11, I fold it in half, I cut it in half, and then I staple it together. So I have sort of like a little booklet, and I draw on the pages very rough, and then use those ideas to do a bigger pencil, and I draw the same size as the printed piece first, so that I don't put too much details in that won't be necessary. And also, I don't like things to reduce down so much that it looks like magic. I like people to see the actual drawing. I did it in stencil and spray paint because no one in mainstream comics had done that before. I thought, and I blurred the panel borders so that everything was sort of coming together. And same as with Spy, I put it on watercolor paper. And this is a little larger. It's 25% larger than the printed form that I did when I colored it. And this is another example. It's colored. And again, it's just spray paint, cut paper. So the metamorphosis. Before I did that, I actually was asked by The Simpsons to do a Treehouse of Horror story. So I thought I'd do The Simpsons as a metamorphosis, where Homer wakes up and he's turned into a bug and goes, no. So in order to get into the process of developing doing characters, I try to get a sense of it, and I kind of figured out how to draw Gregor Samsa. I knew I couldn't make him just a bug because just two facelets, and I knew the reader was going to have to be responding to that. And it's just text, you can bring your own image to it, but I needed to see visualizing would be difficult. I collect photo reference, issues of the library to get that now. Of course, the internet is very helpful. Again, with the thumbnails, that's what they're called, and see what you think of when you read it, which may be quite different than what I did with it. For example, that character over there, he looks a little bit like Trump. I don't think that's what I was thinking of. And there we are. And I don't know if you could see my exhibition last year, but I unfortunately didn't. But thanks to Coach, I was not here for it. But I'm really thrilled to have seen pictures of it. Thanks to Diane. And one of the things also that's been interesting working with the copper material is I've kind of had it move into other areas like doing silk screens of the work. I work with a university, gave me a budget to do different kind of artists' books, limited edition. I love working with copy, stepping on the art. The last adaptation I did was Sorry Brothers. Again, this is the usual pattern I follow to do a book, but I'm now broken that pattern for my latest project. But this is how you can see if you look at that one. They're actually, it may look like just scribbles, but I know what I'm looking at, and it helps me doing it in this small way. If I can make changes, I hate erasing. But at this size, it's not so painful. If I do it this big, throwing out the page, it just very time consuming. So if I make decisions here, then I don't make mistakes when I get to there's the booklet version of it, roughly where the text will go. Then there's the pencil version, and that's a 2-page spread. Then that's in black and white watercolor or watercolor paper. And again, I felt that Heart of Darkness was like a journal. And it was appropriate to do it in more like sketchbook style. So I used a black pencil, took me, I spent 5 years thinking about this idea and deciding it was impossible. And then I had clear space and spent 4 months doing my little booklets. And then I went out to publishers, confident that I would find something interesting immediately. And I was rejected by 20 publishers in the United States, including the ones who told me what a dumb idea was and how very interesting it was. And I never found a publisher in the United States. I found one in England, and they published it. I bought a copy of it. They could look at it. And then they got published in a number of languages, and then won the top award at Comic-Con, which then got me an agent and led to these other projects. So it was like a suicide mission. It took me 3 years to complete the book, ultimately. And, my wife looking at me and saying, we do have to, we both work. Anyway, I depend on, is it pixie dust? I depend on fortune and good luck. And right in the middle of that, Metamorphosis got a royalty from got published in a textbook. And I suddenly got a big check for that copy for that part. And then something else happened. And then, amazingly, Harvard University bought all of the original artwork from Metamorphosis and covered entire scholarship. So and I was able to continue working on those books. But this is really, I really am like, come on, there's a lot of that involved. But I can only say that going for things that are interesting to you, that you love. This was just a project that forced its way out, and I'm just fortunate I was able to clear the space to do it because it changed my career. So there's a scene that I was showing you a sketch of when my wife and I were down at this final March police attack. Well, I took my characters and put them right in the middle of it, and they didn't go away on date night, and so then they got tear gassed and they're caught in the middle. And so I got to shift the story because it was fiction. When I first started getting the work right actually in art school, I did this piece in art school, and I later sold it as an illustration. But I was doing linoleum prints, experimenting, a lot of experimenting with different styles. Some of it was because I was unsure of what I was doing, and some of it was boredom with one style, but some of it was when I worked in this form, I suddenly did something. My work was very different from everything else I did. My pen drawings were very, they looked like other people's work. And this made it look like German expressionism, but it was also like my work. And I started finding work in illustration. And I would work on doing a graphic novel, and I would get paid for years of work on a graphic novel, the same as one illustration for the New York Times. And so I was able to, balance. I love comics so much that I'm going to do them no matter what. And it was, in fact, like a full decade of doing them for almost free and self-publishing and things like that. But I started finding directions, and really, especially when I decided to do more political work, that I had to do doing stupid illustration work, whatever I could get, basically, computer magazines, very boring work that I burned most of that. But then I found this stencil spray paint approach and got more conceptual on images, and I started finding a lot more things. The work fell off when I started turning down jobs that didn't have social political content, because it took me so much work to do an illustration about nothing in particular. But if you said you want to talk about climate change, you want to talk about the gun debate, I had 10 ideas right away. So climate change in particular was something that in the 80s I was feeling very strongly about and concerned, and doing lots of images of this, something from the New York Times, droughts that I probably did now 20 years ago, and Tarzan not finding the swing. And I started stencil and then spray painted it like that and had to deliver that by 7 o'clock. So it was like a 7-hour turnaround, and then it's on the newsstand 2 days later. So it's all, so it just happened that, especially with political work, I was able to do that kind of job just fit with my whatever. And that's a lucky thing. And I got called a lot of times because if you can make the deadline, that's the number one concern. And do something that looks like, has all these elements. At this point, I was using collage, like a hand photo collage. There's a map of Argentina in there. I was playing with maps a lot, which came out of gluing maps in my sketchbook. This was the first cover they had me do, and I did that 7-hour turnaround, and then they sat it for 6 months. And I published it, which I was like, they're giving me a little more time. So I ended up getting, all these really great jobs and doing the kind of political work I wanted to do. And then I moved to Mexico in 2006, and I was away from a lot of that work, and a lot of the art changed. When I got back to New York in 2008, it was right when there was the economic crash, and almost all the magazines either disappeared or the budgets went down, and I had no work. And it was probably that was probably the second time my career completely crashed, and I thought, like, McDonald's counter service, I don't know what I'm going to do. But a lot of what I did is just I do new work and then pitch it around. The Mexican publisher who published my Diary of Oaxaca asked me if I wanted to illustrate Alice in Wonderland. And they had very little money to do this, but I had no work, so I was like, yeah, sure. And I looked at the original Alice in Wonderland and I thought, the original artist John Tenniel used the political figures from his time period, who I didn't recognize. So why not use political from my time period? That's Richard Nixon, the United States, and my daughter is Kelly Alice. And there's Trotsky and Stalin in there, and there's George Bush and Mad Hatter, and I went another direction, more like my sketchbook and watercolor, and I had a really fun time doing this. They also wanted the job done in a ridiculously short period of time because they wanted to be done and published before the movie came out. And it worked very nicely. I got it to them, they published it, and it sold very quickly because of the movie. And so I mentioned I was really interested in insects. I was interested in it going back when I was 4 years old. And this is me at age 10 with my butterfly collection. I loved insects to death, unfortunately. So I collected a lot of them. I had a wake up and thought, I wish I had been into photography and just took pictures. But that's my first insect book. I scrapped me in that cover. And there I am with a Cecropia moth. So this is, one of the things I teach, and I'm saying certain things to students every year. One of them is, identify your passion. What are your passions? And it's a pretty big question. And they change too. And you may not even know what your passions are. They might be there, and you just don't realize you're passionate about it. I forgot how passionate I was about insects. I'm really passionate about them. Now, what I'm working on is this project about insects. Crazily, I proposed this to the New York Public Library, who has this fellowship, and it's they give you money to work at the library for almost a year. And they give you an office, and I got this along with 13 other writers, scholars. I was the only cartoonist and artist there. The guy who won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry was there. It was really above my pay grade, but I can get in there with cartooning because it's so oddball. But so I did this fellowship, and it was during the pandemic. They gave it to me right before the pandemic, and I arrived, and they were like, you can't. Normally, you'd be talking to the other people, and they're saying, there's no talking to anybody. You have your office, the library is closed to the public, so it's just empty. And I was just like, I was so depressed with the libraries, I just thought, this is, it's so typical. It's like we're always, and each generation does it, we always like arrive at the oceans when, the medical waste washes up. It's like, why is it that it's always getting handed, one generation hands the next one, like, I wasn't there for the summer of love and hippies, I was too young to be making love all the time, and, good stuff. So, I was like, I arrived at Underground Comics just when Underground Comics collapsed. It just seemed like that was always going on. I had to make it your own, and you kind of have to. But back to passion. So it's really worth thinking about what your passion is. And so, because whatever your passion is, it will sustain you in being around it, working with it, through the very difficult process of all the years that you might have to not make money at it. Because ultimately, for whatever you're doing, you really only have an audience of one, for sure, and that's yourself. And if you think about what people like, oh, the Ninja Turtles are very popular, so I'll do something like that, and you're not crazy about what you're doing, then you come up with an audience of zero, which would be tragic. So I really trust in, if I love something, I know I'm going to do my best work, and if I can identify what that is. But like I said, I forgot about this when I did the book Ruins, and I was doing the Monarch story. That was one of my favorite books, that book. And so what I approached the library with was, I want to do the history of insects, but where they intersect with humans, where the people who study them. And then the fellowship ended, and I had met somebody in the hallway, one of the workers at the library, a very low-level guy, and I just sort of been friendly to him, and I was like, hey, I'm walking around the library, it's empty, any rooms I might be interested in seeing? He told me at the library, the bookshelves go under the park behind the library. I'm like, no, he took me and showed me that. So we were a little friendly. Well, it turned out after my fellowship ended, he was in a meeting at the library where they were trying to decide, we have these hallways and we need to do an exhibition, and he was like, there's a guy that I saw, he did this work with this fellowship, and it was all drawn about the library with insects, and they asked me if I wanted to do an exhibition, which in 4 months it was up, and it lasted for 6 months. This is a thing I do for Charlie Hebdo, the French magazine. Every week I do a comic on the environment, and so some of them have been insects. They read down, they're wordless, they're fitting with many of the things we've been talking about. Every week I have to come up with a new one. It's a very ongoing thing. I did this for the New Yorker magazine during my fellowship, because this kind of insect, the cicada, in the United States, they go down underground as babies, and they stay underground for 17 years. And somehow, they all know at the same time that they will come out, and they come out by the billions. And they are basically, they have no ability to defend themselves. And so they're like food for all the animals that see them. And all the animals eat them, and they get full and can't eat anymore. And then another billion come out. And that's how they survive. It's crazy. Really crazy idea. But it makes for a really good story. And I did this for the New York Times Book Review, which is all the people that wrote about cicadas in literature. And so I have been talking about that. And there's a cover for a magazine I did. And this is all coming up in my library drawing that where the cicadas make a lot of noise, so the library is shushing them. So I got this exhibition at the library, and it was really like a fluke. I mean, really crazy that they offered me this. And while I was putting together the work I'd done at the library to make a proposal to sell it as a book, so I could keep going with Style is one of those things that we're all like, you gotta get your style, and whatever that is. I think style is going to look good. If you wear it too long, it needs to be washed. And I like to play around with ideas if it's appropriate for the idea that I take somebody else's art and then go in and digitally alter it, like I did for this Syrah. Richie Rich came hanging around and did this parody of George Bush. A couple of those. Dr. Seuss for the more recent event. So, I can manipulate the drawing. Because I'm more interested in the idea than the style. What style will serve little Disney there, the whistle is $15 an hour. You pay very little in the United States, you probably see here. And whistle on the work song. So, this is a little horror comic commentary. So these are different things. This is a turn of the century comic by Winsor McKay. And I took that and turned it into a more recent story of how Donald Trump exploded our things, which so there's the original style, John Tanner, who drew Alice in Wonderland, and there's no take on Donald Trump that appeared in New Yorker, or Dennis the Menace. So I'm always looking for ways to tell these stories and play with them, and it's fun to try different styles. So there's Tracy, there's Trinity, there's Robert Crumb, underground comic artist who I love very much. And there's my recent Charlie Haddock cartoon in Melting. And so now I'm also doing sort of a single gag cartoons. I wish very much of those who think we contracted. This is a little bit of a sketch. Sorry. You want me to wrap up? I can stop now. No. So, the New Yorker magazine has a website, and the way they do it is I have to pitch them an idea at 9 in the morning. I just email them an idea, this is something I sent in, and then they look at all the ideas. They get maybe 50 or 100 people sending in at 9 in the morning, and then at 9:30 they say, okay, this one, and then after we finish it up by noon. And I, at different times, when I pitch in 5 days a week, I may sell something once every 3 months. So it's a lot of work, but this is a little bit of my process. This, I did a sketch and digital color this. The digital color is a little bit too candy color for me, so I like to add, put an overlay of old paper on it and multiply it in Photoshop, which gives it sort of a unified quality. I'm trying to be positive, I really am. But nobody likes them until this. I keep on looking, with current events, there's a lot of tragedy, and a lot of things to be intense about, and I try to find ways to talk about that and not completely bum people out. But also, the beauty of art is that you don't have to draw things as they are, always going to draw things as you hope they would be. So I try to do an occasional upbeat thing, and the way that people can stand up and do something and move these false leaders behind. And maybe one day in the United States with healthcare, who knows? It's a crazy idea. And, I have a daughter, there's my daughter moving to New Mexico. So I have a very strong reason to want things to be around for when she gets older. She's older now, she's 25. This is sprayed on the wall in Mexico and said the revolution will not be televised. But I do believe it will be illustrated. And however, in that process, as we fight to get things, that are here for lives better, and get to make the music that we want to hear, got optioned by HBO, and it's been a year and a half developing an animated show that then collapsed. It was really exciting watch. Got all these great people doing voice acting and all this. It was going to be really cool. I was really racing to get a lot of those autobiographical films done when I was a certain age, because, talking about, masturbating, losing their virginity, doing drugs, things like that. I was, that seemed like appropriate topics for is what I want to talk about then. And I've had, what I'm interested in talking about keeps shifting. So that sort of, I haven't done that more recently, but I have a lot of autobiographical films that I'd like yet to do. What I've kind of done with this insect project is I've made it kind of, they're telling their own autobiography, so I have them all talking. Because I did, in fact, I thought, I really love doing autobiographical work. How can I do that and do this kind of project? And that was, they were it was very interesting doing it because we put things down on paper and be horrified that embarrassed that I had said what I said, and then it gets published, but it was also very, it was really great to get that down because the title, it really does represent, I almost forgetting my younger self, and so I have now evidence of who I was. I can actually look at that and read my comments and go, oh yeah, I remember that. So it's very helpful it's like keeping the diary. But I still have a lot of stories I'd like to tell. It's just a matter of hours in the day and outlets for that kind of work too.
You concluded in a very positivistic way, but having spent so much time in the engaged illustration or art, how do you feel as an artist returning to the political, social topics?
Well,
maybe again and again, or even repetitive, or in a loop?
Well, some of it is repetitive in the most depressing way. It's, things not changing and getting worse. Going to war, to sort of like I do my own thing there, and you know, which that doesn't subscribe to that. But a lot of the things that I learned about a lot about the environment from reading this comic called Slow Death that came out in 1970, so it's 11 or 12, and comics were showing about environmental catastrophe, and science fiction was doing the same thing, where a lot, you know, science fiction told you a lot about a dystopic future, and so that's been available, you know, and more relevant, you know. So some of it really works well and stands up, and some of it doesn't.